people. Yeah, tell me what you think about the Bowen system, Jose.
Um, I when I look at it in the perspective of the body of Christ, it
Hmm.
covers all grounds. It covers a lot. And what I mean by that, you have the group of the bodies. For example, one thing that I seen was a triangulation.
Hmm.
Uh, and I put that in a lens as in families who kind of tend to unite with another one and kind of uh, just stick in that sense. And then also the over functioning, the under functioning was another one that I kind of
Ooh.
that I've seen performed throughout the church, and
Mhm.
that is with the narratives of the Bible.
Oh.
And one over functioning was when I noticed it brings a lot of examples of David,
Hmm.
his under functioning of not leaving to go to war
Oh,
with
yeah.
with uh with his comrades or camaraderie or his warriors. He ended up sinning. Uh, he uh, ended up committing murder over that sin. So that's one underfunction that kind of went bad. And then another overfunction was by his I believe his nephews,
Hmm.
which he commanded to kill Uriah the Hittite, which is an overfunction on his behalf, but he enabled sin. He committed he and I think that I related to that in the sense where you mentioned about big trauma, little trauma within the church and leadership,
Hmm.
and I just kind of resonated on that, uh, that how it could really be impactful. And there's more. Also, I think I don't know if this is differentiation, the
Hmm.
gauge of where people is at mentally in maturity and spirituality, right? You kind of gauge yourself at a 50, 75, 100 or less, and it kind of puts you in like in a plateau of like with only certain individuals. Um, where like okay, like let's say I'm a 75, I will only kind of like engage with people who are at that level or humble myself to lower or move my way on up to like 100. So that's one of the things. So it's like a gauge that I kind of like observed, and just a lot of things. Um, I seen the how powerful if one knows all these things, it could be very powerful.
Hmm.
And then also was kind of like a little bit bummed out because the Bowen system didn't even he didn't get into the supernatural, the ninth concept that he brought up, and I was just like, man, that would have been powerful. Uh, I was just like really up on that, right? Like, I wish he could have uh, I wish somebody could like pick up that case study and like really dive into uh, that concept within the body of Christ. So yeah, those are just one of the couple things that I jotted down, but there's plenty of more, and things like that.
Wow. I'm taking notes from what you shared, Jose, and that is all really fantastic. Um,
Yeah,
so what I wrote down was sounds like differentiation is really sparked in lots of ideas, and welcome, Emmy.
hi,
Um,
Emmy.
and you were thinking a lot about triangulation and how sometimes families can kind of unite for or against one particular individual in the family, like either as like a scapegoat or maybe as in other ways. And then you thought about overfunctioning and underfunctioning in the church and the family and examples of scripture. And I think, when I think of underfunctioning, that example with King David and how he was, hanging out in his palace while everyone was fighting in war. I think that's a perfect example, you know? And then that last question, I haven't thought about that before. Uh, I think it's a really good question. To what extent are we differentiated? You know how Bowen had that scale, it could be 75. And, I think there's in one of the chapters, he talks about how you can apply that scale on the emotional maturity of a whole society. And he said something like, it dropped 20%, you know, it feels like it's dropped a lot in recent history here in America. But that's just Dr. Wang's opinion. You don't have to necessarily agree with me. But you also asked the question, does it shape who we associate with? Um, so in other words, I was thinking of, well, do people who are low in differentiation, do they tend to be friends with or associate more with others who also have low differentiation? And similarly, do people with high differentiation tend to associate more with others who have high differentiation? I think my tentative feeling is that the answer might be possible. Yes, it's not like we don't have any relationships with people in different levels of differentiation, but I think it might be fair to say that highly differentiated people have a lot healthier boundaries than low differentiated people. So it's possible to say that, for someone who's highly differentiated, when they encounter someone who might not have good boundaries, they aren't as vulnerable to get sucked in. Because as someone who struggles with boundaries oftentimes, oftentimes very emotionally mature, especially when I was younger, I think because I didn't have those boundaries, I would just be a lot more prone to get sucked into being tricked by people, manipulated by people, like used by people, all sorts of stuff that happens to many, Christian leaders and pastors. And it might be fair to say that if you're highly differentiated, you tend to not get sucked in. So maybe you won't you may not hang out as much with. But then if you're a pastor of a church or a congregation or a community, you don't really have a choice because there's going to be people in your community with high and low and everything in between. So you might still be in relationship with them, but maybe not get sucked into some of the unhealthy kind of tendencies.
No, yes, and thank you for sharing that. But one thing that came into mind constantly was like a like a food for thought as I was reading this, right? And
Mm.
I think this is going back to a previous week that we spoke on this on leadership. But some of these uh, some of these parts of the system, they kind of bring trauma, don't they? Like you said, how a family or person or individual has their boundaries on who they associate with. So they're kind of like limiting themselves, but also kind of like excluding other members from the body, and they're in leadership position or not paying attention to them or not guiding them the right way can lead them into like can lead them kind of lost within the church. Um am I Yeah, so that's one of my like that's one thing that I see. Like if I'm in leadership position, which means that my boundaries are I'm in a gauge that's higher, and I have people below me. And if for some reason my guidance or my leadership does not lead them the wrong way, the right way, they could be uh, end up receiving some kind of um traumatic an experience, traumatic experience.
I think you're onto something. I think a lot of uh, church hurt, and
Yeah.
I see it all the time. In my private practice, and when I talk to other pastors or other Christian leaders. A lot of ministry related emotional hurt. I think it really is a matter of fundamentally, it's a matter of some sort of unhealthy triangulation or a matter of poor differentiation. And uh, and it's not just one person being hurtful to someone else. It's like a whole community, kind of unconsciously conspiring to you know um, treat an individual or a leader in a certain way. So for example, under functioning, like some I've seen lots of congregations just not care about their leaders. The leaders going through some stuff, and like, the spouse is going through cancer, or there's some crisis that they're in, and the community just kind of neglects them. And other examples, there's communities will blame their leaders. They'll either idealize them or they'll demonize them. Neither are very helpful. We can talk a little bit more about that. The psychological term for that is splitting. Um, so you split someone into either all good or all bad, and that's a thing. That's poor differentiation, and it's something that I believe most, if not all, people in Christian leadership or leadership in general have run into. Either that you get idealized and you can't do anything wrong, or you get demonized and you can't do anything right. And then you add scripture to it, and people kind of spiritualize that, and uh, it's not good for our ego, and it's also not good for our emotional health, no matter what. Or burnout, the over functioning, and under functioning, where people don't want to do stuff to contribute to the organization, and they leave it to the leader to do everything for everyone, and that's another example. I'm sure we can think of many, many more beyond that as well. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, don't feel like you're on the spot, but I'd love to hear, if you have any thoughts about anything we've talked about so far, like triangulation or, over functioning, or anything like that.
Just listening and kind of trying to get myself in the headspace where you all are at,
Yeah.
because it's morning here. Just woke up.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, I'm probably trying to dig into my own experience of leadership and ministry, and then trying to connect what Jose is saying and how that applies. So I don't have any comments right away. I probably will, but I'm just taking it in.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Is it just posing questions or just kind of interacting with the material and things like that?
Yeah, we're just posing questions and interacting with materials. So I mean,
Okay.
maybe a starting point could be a question that I can ask the two of you is, um, where have you seen emotional triangles, either in families or in the context of communities? And I remember Bowen talks about how triangles are not necessarily good or bad, and oftentimes we can't avoid them. But if we can, it's really good to be thoughtful and careful about them. But my sense is that triangles can be harmful if we don't know that we're being triangulated, and um, and the way that we're triangulated is not very helpful. Um, so he gave an example where, sometimes people will triangulate, like, a mother and a father might triangulate one of their children, as the source of their concern or blame, and one of the reasons, and it's not the only one, is that maybe there's this larger issue that they're unwilling to deal with. So instead of dealing with this larger issue, they're just going to micromanage the kid and like focus on the kid's problem when it's actually this kind of larger issue. Something else that I may not be in the book that is very common that I've seen is when a mother and father don't know how to resolve conflict or communicate with each other. And then what they do is they triangulate one to the children and go, hey, you tell this to mom, and then you tell this to dad, and or when they triangulate a child by trying to get them on their side, where it's like, dad is the bad guy. Don't you see that mom's, trying her best, and trying to kind of have a tug of war. And unfortunately, you do see this when sometimes when couples divorce, where they try to pull a child into one side or the other. And usually, when triangulation happens, it is not for the benefit of the child. In fact, the child doesn't get not only does not get any benefit, but usually it's harmful for the child in that way, and it's harming the child so that it can fulfill some needs on one or more of the parent.
I was sort of thinking about, I feel kind of guilty because when it happens, just in married life or with kids, uh, yeah, like if my husband and I uh have a disagreement or something, or we're just, not happy, and then I'll be like, yeah, I'll maybe warn one of my kids, like, okay, we're just not doing well right now, or he needs some time to himself. Um, a little warning, but I don't know if I triangulate, but I probably do.
Mhm.
Um, but I was sort of thinking about like how that works also in a ministry context or in a
Mhm.
church.
Mhm.
Um, I'm trying to figure out how to describe this, but I work in Tokyo, so in an Asian context,
Mhm.
and I feel like when there's conflict in the church or in within individuals, um, how do you not get people in certain camps? Like you want to be, you know, uh, not partial, but you also need to have a pulse on what's going on. Um, but if you don't speak about a certain situation, then you're not getting the information or the intel that you need to kind of manage. So I feel like it's a interesting dance that you have to do to
Yeah.
be aware as a leader,
Yeah.
um,
Right.
but not get pulled to a certain side or seemingly interpret that you're on one side or the other. Um, and I feel like well, I know we experienced this in our church, especially when there was a lot of conflict during COVID,
Mhm.
when people weren't meeting, and even without COVID, I think that it's how do you do this and do this well? So I don't have a particular question, but I just feel like it's complex because I you probably don't want to get in this triangulation situation, but you can easily get pulled into that. Um,
Mhm.
so I don't know if you have anything to comment on that, having worked with people in ministry when they're in a yeah, a very a complex situation in their church
Yeah.
or in an organization for that matter.
Yeah, that great thoughts there. I think sometimes we can't avoid triangulation, and I think it was really helpful for the author and Bowen to emphasize that triangle emotional triangles in and of themselves are not necessarily good or evil, you know. So in the context of like a family, it's helpful to kind of acknowledge both sides, even if so I wouldn't read into that too much. It's but within the context of a church, two examples that are fairly common would be, say a church member is really unhappy with the direction of the church that a church is heading, so instead of talking directly to the pastors or to the staff, they will just talk to other congregation members, and then it's almost as if like they have assigned the work of talking to the staff and the pastors to all the friends, and then the friends, are kind of that third party, so it's like this got this individual, it's got an issue with the pastors or got an issue with the church, and then now there's this growing group of in the congregation that is trying to be the go-between to kind of pass and go, hey, so and so is unhappy, and I just, and I think the key thing about what makes that a triangle is that the person who's unhappy with the direction of the church actually never directly communicates that to the leadership, um, and that's what makes it potentially not very helpful. Like just because we have disagreement and conflicts, not an issue. We work through that, but it's the refusal. Like I have something to say, but I refuse to actually communicate. So I instead rely on other people to communicate on behalf of me. So and sometimes people can kind of weaponize this and go, oh, I'm so scared that the leaders are going to, retaliate or not make, and almost kind of set themselves up as like a victim, and that's not very helpful. although and that's lots more to talk about that, but another example would be like two church staff members, for example, having conflict with one another. And instead of, it's kind of like that elephant in the room that no one talks about, and, unfortunately, sometimes in church cultures or in, larger cultures where, indirect communication is a little bit more normative than direct communication, there is and I know that might be the case in some Asian cultures. Uh, there is a little bit more of a vulnerability for triangulation. But I would say even in contexts such as that, there's ways that you can still communicate indirectly, and you can indirectly communicate without involving another person, you know. Uh, but again, that's another, conversation down the line. But I think another example would be say there's like a couple, like a husband and a wife who are having, conflict with each other, and then and then one of them brings in the pastor and goes, "Hey, I need you to fix our marriage," and um, and one of the laws of emotional triangles, and this goes back all the way to Friedman, is that he says that attempts to change the relationship of the original two sides of the emotional triangle are generally not going to be effective and will tend to make things worse. Yeah. Um, And not only that, but another law is that to the extent of a third party tries to unsuccessfully change the relationship of the other two, it's more likely that that third party will wind up carrying the stress for the other two. Um, yeah. So Friedman would say this actually explains why in many families, it's the one being triangulated is actually usually not the weakest person in the system, but it's actually one of the strongest person. It's the person who is not only the strongest, but and also the one that has not only the capacity but the willingness to take responsibility for the entire system. Yeah, Jose.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be over functioning for somebody like um over functioning? Isn't that some you eventually were gonna get burned out or you're gonna get little exhaustion and things like so it's like this triangular just has like this outer sphere with it too that it's just like it's just it's just very exhaustive.
Yes, 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 and yes.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And that's
Um,
actually probably the story behind many, leaders who burn out. It's because we have grown up doing this in our family, and we go into a church system, and we end up doing it in the church system. And then we become the sacrificial lamb in the process.
oh, wow.
I think a part of it, and when I work with other individuals, and also when I find myself in them in my own life. I mean, I find myself in these things too. Um, I feel like, one of the steps that's helpful in untangling someone from an emotional triangle is um, owning our limitations and grieving, and a common statement that I'll practice myself and I'll actually, bring up in a therapy context, for example, a psychotherapy complex context, for example, would be, I I really wish that I could fix your marriage, but I don't have the capacity uh, to change either of you and to change your relationship. I can offer some feedback. I can listen to both of you. I can help facilitate greater communication, but if one side or both sides are just, intent on not listening to the other and punishing the other, I am not God, and I can't make any of you, either of you, change that. Or relatedly, when there's people who are, so intent on making decisions that are not wise, and they're now suffering the consequences of their decisions. Um, so a lot of times I see, this with parents and children, where the parents are just rigid and stubborn, and they insist on going forward, even though it's, not wise. And then when they suffer the consequences, they try to pull in their children, their adult children, to, kind of ameliorate some of the consequences and to save them, And I've talked to lots of children of, who are now adults and go, hey, I really wish that you didn't do this. And I do love you, and you suffering is, does not make me happy. And I would love to see you, suffer less. And at the same time, if you're going to make a decision, I can't save you from the consequences of this, you know? Um, and I have to grieve that. And if a child, and I think this is another pattern, and this is related to Jose, what you're talking about, not just overperforming or overfunctioning, but underfunctioning. When you have children that are used to this role of, saving their parents, cleaning up after their parents, then the parents actually never grow up. And this also happens, when the parents overfunction and the children, underfunction, where if you don't allow people, uh, the freedom to suffer to face and experience the consequences of their own choices, they actually never learn and never grow. So it's almost like we are enabling, contributing to their perpetual emotional immaturity. Of course, this is all conceptual. It's easier said than done, but when you're in the actual situation, it's really hard.
Yeah, yes. I kind of agree with that, right? Getting kind of like capturing that triangulation. One thing that I noticed, I wrote down, right, that maybe to get out of that triangulation, I'm hoping maybe owning to our own limitations would be one way
Yes,
to
that's right.
kind of like saying, hey, I can't really do that much, or right? And then communicate, and next time trying to be aware of those triangulations, right? It will be
And we
but
can, we can even incorporate what you just said in prayer, like owning our limitations. One thing we can do is we can pray and confess to God, like, God, I want to I confess that I don't have the power to change these people. I don't have the power to make someone listen and understand someone else. If they're set on making this decision, I don't have the power to change their mind. Um, and I wish that the consequences were not there, and I also confess that I don't have the power to change that. And then that helps us kind of decouple us from like that temptation to want to take responsibility for something that we don't have power to take responsibility for. Because if we keep taking responsibility for someone else in an emotional triangle in an unhealthy, undifferentiated system, then there's always going to be consequences for us. Like something will be neglected, either our own needs or, if we're adult children with children, then maybe our children's needs, like something important in our own lives is going to be neglected if we keep over functioning elsewhere. And it's hard because a lot of times family members know how to, strike, just kind of know how to uh, mess with us and get us upset, make us feel guilty. say those the right words to get us to do what they want us to do. And yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say when it comes to family, they know those weak points, or siblings know that too, all too well. Yeah, for sure. I thank you for just mentioning that tip of being able to pray and confess when you don't have the power to change
Yeah.
people or the situation, because I feel like I straddle that a lot in my work. And
Mm,
um, yeah, I can think of different examples and even current examples of when there's a staff member where you want to help or give feedback, where there's things that they are doing that are either harming themselves or harming others. Um, and so I've been trying to like kind of gather info, but not side with different people. But I'm also in a position of giving the feedback. And when you see someone kind of making these missteps, yeah, how
mhm,
honest can you be? I want to be honest, but I also want to be loving in that so that they can receive that kind of feedback. Um, and then the reading and just this class is also making me think of, well, how about their own awareness? You can't force someone to be reflective and aware. In a particular situation, this person is always on go mode, and I think causing difficulties because they're not reflective or they don't take
mm,
ownership. So it's just hard.
mhm,
Um, yeah, and then I also think about with like, well, what is their history or what's their context? I think that this person has experienced some trauma in their life, and so they are like over functioning, or and they spiritualize things, so it makes it hard to give them feedback, especially when they feel like this is what God I'm gifted in, this is what God is having me do, or look at this situation and how it worked out. This is clearly God. And how do you um offer wise counsel? And what am I not seeing too? Like it's not that I'm the know-it-all in the situation either.
yeah.
So I kind of sometimes second guess myself too. Is like, well, at what point do I offer my perspective and feedback? Because my way may not be the only way. So it's just, I feel like these different voices in a sometimes challenging situation, right? When you're in leadership, you want to be discipling and caring, pastoring for people, and then you see how they're functioning and the impacts that they have on other people and the system, right? And there's only so much you can do, right? Like just um, not taking over responsibilities. Like I can offer what I can offer, but their response is also theirs, right? So I don't know if I'm trying to be general, but so other people who are listening can also relate in some way in ministry. But
Mm.
bless
Yes.
you.
Thank you. Yeah. That all sounds really, really good. And that all sounds really, really understandable.
Yeah.
And, in an ideal world, um, if there, I mean, well, if there was perhaps one individual that might be kind of at the center of a lot of conflict and tension in a larger system, in an ideal world, the body of Christ or the community or the, different family members would kind of collectively, address it to get, together, like, just each person, gently having direct conversation with that individual, as they see it. But in reality, I know that oftentimes that doesn't happen,
Mhm.
and um, going back to Friedman's laws of emotional triangles, I think one helpful guide that he offers is that he says we can only change a relationship to which we belong. And And even if we belong to a relationship, I would even add, it's not guaranteed that we can change it, you know. But perhaps putting those two thoughts together, we only have a fighting chance to change a relationship to which we belong. So if we don't even belong to the relationship, we don't even have a fighting chance, to change that. So the first question is, do I belong to that relationship? And he also talks about, well, if I happen to be in a triangle, um, if it's possible, to try our best to maintain a non-anxious presence within that triangle, and um, I'm guessing that both of you are probably familiar as well as, many other people in our class that what it's like to be a anxious presence in a triangle. And unfortunately, I'm familiar personally and also professionally with many examples of people who are manipulating. Well, where they will actually create anxiety on purpose to try to triangulate people, you know. Um, so even though, there's a conflict that hasn't become a crisis, they will actually try to make it a crisis so that people will finally get pulled in, and in situations like that, and I'm speaking in, somewhat in generalities because, there's always nuance in specific situations. There's a term that I learned fairly recently, like a couple of years ago, and it's called gray rocking. Have you guys ever heard of that term? Gray rocking. So, gray rocking is when you don't even respond. And sometimes I would like to submit um, that is the best out of a bunch of bad options. So sometimes you only have like three options available, and all of them are bad. You know, all of them have consequences. All of them have certain risks. And when, some forms of relational emotional manipulation, it's actually a trap where um, they will create artificially a crisis that is designed to evoke either one response or a second response. And part of the manipulation is that there's a game plan for both responses. So if you respond in this way, you're probably going to get blamed for not doing the other one, and then they'll find a way to use that against you. But if you were to go back in time and do the exact opposite, they'll end up blaming you for not doing the other one, and then they'll use that against you as well, and the only option out of all the bad options is to not give them either of those responses. And sometimes it just means I don't respond at all. So if I get a inflammatory text, um, sometimes I will advise people, or if other people get an inflammatory text, I'll just advise them to ignore it. Don't even give a response, or give as neutral or as a non emotionally reactive response as possible. Like, well, the sky is falling, blah, 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 blah. And then your response would be just, okay. And then don't respond immediately. Wait at least several hours. Don't create a back and forth and just press OK, period. And then don't ask for more. Don't get sucked into it anymore.
I was wondering if, in your experience of working with pastors and leaders, for this kind of situation or a situation where there's a singular person causing a lot of chaos, like distress, um, do you find that these kind of people have personality disorders? Like, just like, I mean, their responses are out of proportion, or they triangulate, or I guess the term is also people feel like they're walking on eggshells. So they have, yeah, it doesn't equate. Like, why is this person doing this? Or people, if you use another term, feel traumatized because of how their explosive emotional responses, anger, what have you. I just am reflecting back on some scenarios where, um, wow, this person has been super destructive and has hurt a number of people. But in the beginning, they could be people of woo, or like they can like they're just charismatic or what have you. Like they're not on all cases, but you don't you kind of get lured in and then they cause these kind of issues and then you're like, what do you do? There's a lot of injury. And so in two particular circumstances that I can think of in my own life, I'm like, oh, okay, this makes sense. I mean, I'm not supposed to diagnose them, right? Because I'm not their therapist or anything, but it helped provide some context. Like, it turned from anger to compassion a little bit and some understanding when uh yeah, there's circumstances like this where you have to kind of be a little colder or self-protective, right? Create that boundary um in order to function yourself. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
mm,
All of that. And,
okay.
I've learned the term gray rock within a context of conversations about personality disorders.
Mm,
So, if that stuff that I just talked about sounds familiar, then there's a chance that you might be dealing with a situation with a personality disorder. And, as you know, um, the field of psychology, we don't know how to treat personality disorders. Um, our under Generally, our understanding is that those are not treatable, and the best we can do for some of them is contain. Um, and for others, if it's possible to treat, we're talking about long-term restructuring of someone's personality. So we're talking about 3 therapy sessions a week for like several, 4, 5, 6, 7 years to kind of move the needle somewhat. But we don't use language like cure, or
mm,
um, uh, yeah. Um,
mm,
so, where a lot of Christian leaders get stuck is we kind of have a formula in our mind, that's like, oh, if we just need to love people to health,
mm,
love people to Christ, exercise grace and,
mm,
um, and we will get eaten up alive in a
mm,
situation like that, and we
mm,
have to be cold. Not cold, but there has to
mm,
be um, firm boundaries that at times might feel cold.
mm. Yeah, I feel like because sometimes when we try to do the loving or gracious response, then you feed kind of more fuel into that situation, and so it is a learned response in some ways, and having to, in my situation, just kind of do some self-talk of being like, okay, you're doing what's good for the situation and for yourself, and it's not that you're not being loving, those kinds of things. But it is hard to fight that, I think, um, when you're wired to care or be pastoral, what have you.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, and there's so many ways to, manipulate Christian language like forgiveness,
Mhm.
grace, to complicate things even further. If individuals like that are in a position of authority, that's really difficult. Um,
Mm,
if they're not in a position of like the highest authority, it does often mean that the person with authority is going to be implicated whether they like it or not. And it's probably going to be kind of painful for that leader, because they're going to have to make some difficult calls. And like uh, one of the you know at- one of the red flags of potential personality disorders is psychological splitting. So we talked about splitting earlier today, and splitting is, when you look at someone and they're either all good or all bad. That happens to counselors too. So when I train, psychologists, I'll say, hey, there's going to be some clients that they're going to tell you that you're like the best thing since sliced bread, that you're God's gift to, the world. And you're going to feel really good, and that it might be, that you are a good counselor, you can take that. But in the back of your head, uh, make a little mental note and go, well, I might not be that good. And, and what comes up will always come down. Um, and I think a general orienting, a principle that I follow is, like I think last week we talked about humility. It's about seeing myself accurately, and generally we as leaders, if it's possible, we want to lead in a way where people can see us accurately as well, you know. So I would say that a low differentiated community or congregation is going to be very resistant to seeing their leaders accurately, so um, either they will refuse to acknowledge that the leader has flaws, even though everyone else that's more differentiated is like, dude, you don't see that? And they're like, no, 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 it's da 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 da, and they'll make excuses and blah 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 blah, and or they will demonize a leader. They can't do anything good, and um, and it can change on a dime. And if that leader ends up making the decisions that they probably need to make to protect the rest of the, organization or community, they're going to get demonized at some point. So it's uh, yeah. So leaders bear pain; they don't cause pain, and it's always really hard. It's not fair when leaders have to bear pain for stuff that they didn't cause, you know. Oh, this is such a really, I'm really enjoying this conversation. Thank you, both of you.
No, thank you, Professor. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that too, on the leadership, right? Because reading Bowen's reading the book, right? The first part of it is the map, the orienting, right? And then the second part is the practical. Um, One thing that I dove in that section was the pastoral care, about how um, into all this triangulation and all these concepts that he mentioned, I focused on pastoral care, and he mentioned something about pastoral care is in the context of the secular or not things outside the church. And that's one thing that I was like wanted to ask you the difficulties of that, that not to get too attached or like not to just to give advice to leaders within the church, right? And people who attend your church or who are believers, but give them the pastoral care in the church's context. I wanted to see how is that a difficult thing to do? Knowing, as you said right now, that some leaders get demonized if you do if it's if if you give somebody some advice and it's not well received, you get demonized. And that's something that about like I was like I put myself in the pastor's shoes or in that pastoral care, and I was just like, how difficult is that? How can you maneuver through all that? How can you navigate through that? I was hoping maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, sure thing. And I uh I did enjoy that chapter. I think it was chapter 6, like pastoral care, helping without hurting. And as I was reading that book, I was kind of taking notes and doing some highlighting. I mean, this was really good reading for me too. I've read Friedman stuff, but I haven't read this particular book, and I really appreciated how practical and how much more it kind of how thoughtful it was. And some of the things that stuck out to me in that chapter was he talks about how when pastors or leaders are on the lower end of the differentiation scale, a lot of times we could find ourselves in in vulnerable situations when we meet like a very demanding or dependent person in the community, or we might be working with like a whole, or maybe the whole community is very demanding, or the whole community is very dependent, and he talks about how one possibility is that pastors who are or leaders who are very empathetic, we may be more vulnerable to seek the quick fixes so that we can alleviate the pain that's right in front of us in the moment, you know. And so instead of kind of addressing the underlying issues, we kind of go for that quick fix so that we don't have to like we're spared of that emotional intensity, in that moment. And then he wrote this, I double highlighted this. He talked about Stanley Hauerwas, once accused the contemporary pastor of being a quivering mass of availability. So, I think what he meant is, he's talking about those pastors who, have to always be available and responsive to everyone, everywhere, and not having boundaries of, so if someone tries to text you at 9 p.m., it's really okay to wait till the tomorrow morning, unless if it's life-threatening, but that's, one example of many. Yeah. Um, And I think he talks about on the higher end of the differentiation scale, a leader will not assume responsibility for solving other people's problems, but will be accompanying them. Will walk with them and gently remind them of Christ's presence and think with them about the struggles that they're facing. So it's not I'm carrying it for you or I'm taking responsibility, but it's more of I'm accompanying, I'm walking alongside. I found that was really helpful. Again, when you're actually in the moment, it's hard, and we might need to go back to the chapter and reread it and reflect on how it applies to us because when we're actually in the moment, we have these natural dispositions that get activated. And that's when we need to go back to this conversation the most. And we're not going to be perfect. We're probably going to mess up along the way. So, the goal is not for us to jump from a 2 out of 10 differentiation straight to 10. If we can get to 3 or 4 or 5, that's a lot better than two.
I know with the different points in the book, you're like, oh my gosh, that applies. Oh, this applies. Oh, how do I do this? Like, okay, this is 0 to 1 is okay. Don't go to 10.
Yeah.
That's encouraging.
And I've heard people say that whenever we're trying to live our life in a new way, we're almost always going to feel guilty.
Hmm.
So sometimes guilt is, because maybe we're doing something we probably should do something else. But another possibility is that we're feeling guilty because we're actually going into uncharted territory that we've never had before. So, don't interpret guilt as I shouldn't have done this. Interpret guilt, practice meditation, observe it neutrally and go and observe it long enough to discern if maybe in fact that guilt is because you're actually taking the steps to go this direction that you've always been needing to go for a long time, but you've never done before. Wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you,
Yeah,
Emmy.
you're very
Thank you.
welcome. I'll stop the recording.